Hey everybody, thank you so much for being here. This week I had the pleasure of sitting down and chatting with Vrin Rao from Illuminate NYC. Vrin is an Enneagram coach and a meditation teacher. She works with women and those who identify with the female energy to build strong and healthy relationships with themselves and with others. She does this by using the personality framework of the Enneagram to help others identify their core motivations, which are directly influenced by each of our specific needs and fears. Vrin is also a meditation teacher and a lifelong practitioner of Nada Yoga, Japa Yoga, and Kirtan Yoga. She's also well-versed in Tantra, chakra meditation, Swara Yoga, and Yoga Nidra. Okay, confession time. I have to tell you guys that when I first connected with Vrin, I really didn't know anything about what the Enneagram was. I mean, I had vaguely heard about it, like I knew there was a number system and that people associated with that number system, but then I was like, okay, well, when you find your number, then what? So if you're feeling a little bit clueless, I want you guys to know it's totally okay. I'm here with you, and in this episode, we are going to dive into what the Enneagram is and how we can use it as a tool to discover our own unconscious behavior. The Enneagram can really help us to face our shadow and work with our shadow as a way to grow the relationships that we have, either with ourselves or with other people. So I want to share with you guys that my favorite takeaway from this interview is learning that the Enneagram is not designed to put us into a box, but it's actually a really beautiful way for us to have a language for self-development and for growth. Okay, I'm done chatting about this. I'm so excited for you guys to listen. So let's dive into this week's episode with Vrin. This is Clarity Through Chaos, and I'm your host, Fiona Hardwick. This podcast features unscripted conversations that uncover and celebrate the chaos that has helped us to transform our greatest fears and vulnerabilities into clarity. Through spirituality, the woo-woo kind, and self-development, because I just love to be practical, we are going to take a look at what has helped us to step into our own unique power, allowing for us to transform our most important relationship, the relationship to ourselves. Together, because I know you're ready, we're going to dive into the chaos and find our clarity. So let's just go ahead and start with how were you introduced to meditation?
I was born and raised in a family that practiced Bhakti Yoga, which is known as the yoga of love and devotion. And meditation has always been a really integral part of that lifestyle, of that process. And the primary type of meditation I was introduced to was mantra meditation. And so repeating transcendental sound. And the concept of sound vibration was always very prevalent within our household. And it's something that I'm really grateful for, because there is so much nuance and subtleties to the sound vibrations that we become exposed to. And that's just been something that I try to remember in terms of what I offer to other people, and also something that I really try to pay attention to in terms of what I'm being exposed to.
That's so special. Where did you grow up?
I grew up, born and raised in Montreal, and then we moved.
French?
Un petit peu, oui.
Oh, yes. I've been learning. I've been using Duolingo.
You
have
have
a mission to learn how to speak French.
It's a great language. It's such a beautiful language.
It really is.
A little complicated with the verbs and the tenses, but a beautiful language.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So did you find that was the norm, like you're growing up, like having that strong meditation background? Did you feel like different from your friends, similar? Like, how did that look?
It's a great question. I felt definitely a little bit different, something that I've struggled with for most of my life. And one of the things, though, that always felt very normal to me was the practice of meditation, just being surrounded by it. So when I was in another environment where people didn't meditate, I could really feel it.
Yeah.
But I also did feel like maybe something was different for me. Right. And there can be, especially when we're young, this need to fit in very much. Yeah, and so then kind of wondering, well, why is this happening at my house, but at the same time, just really appreciating it, because a lot of mantra meditation was to music, and music has been something that
Yeah.
I don't know how we can live without music. It's
It's
just
so true.
so powerful.
It
We
really
can
is.
express so much emotion that we can't express and articulate into words.
Yeah. I find that with my children, I have a 10 and 11-year-old, and my 11-year-old especially, he's so into music. Like if we're going somewhere, if he's getting ready to, play soccer or whatever, like he's in control of what we're listening to. And I'm just like, do you, because I recognize that to him, there's a very powerful connection. So it's really, that's super special. And even going back to this, like, all right, we'll time out. We'll come back to it. Let's jump into the Enneagrams because that's where I want to tie this whole thing in. So let's talk about how you were introduced to the Enneagram.
It's a funny story, actually. So I was probably in my early 30s when I just very naturally started to feel like there must be some type of system or some type of kind of process by which we could really try to understand ourselves better. And so growing up with the background of Bhakti, Vedic astrology has been very prominent in my life. Yes. And so
Hold the phone. Yes.
and so I knew that there was definitely a influence of the planets there. But then along with that, there is a particular nature that we all come into this world with. And so I was doing a lot of research into natures already when I met my husband. And I had no idea what the Enneagram was. And he said, well, I'm running this workshop with my best friend and business partner. And they've both been studying the Enneagram at that time for about 11 years. And he said, I think that you'll be interested in this, just because I was already kind of dabbling into these things. And so I went for the workshop, and mind blown, really. That was how I felt, because I really found it was this incredible blueprint to understand our motivations and to give us a language to speak about it. Because most of us may have an idea of what are the motivations that we're run by, but at least for myself, I can say 70-80% of it is very unconscious. We just kind of feel like, oh, this is who I am, not recognizing that it's actually a motivation that's driving me to behave a certain way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So let's talk about, you said that, tying in the Vedic astrology, and I also believe like we kind of come in here with a blueprint. Do you find that the Enneagrams are applicable to just adults, or do you find that children can kind of play around with their own types as well?
It's a great question. So it's said that actually you can start to see the nature of an individual from a very, very young age, very young age. And so as a child, 3, 4, 5 years old, they may not be able to kind of say, oh, yes, this is me. But as parents or as well-wishers, friends, looking at the child, and if we have an understanding of the Enneagram, you can already start to narrow down what could potentially be the kind of that underlying blueprint that's driving them. And it's amazing, because if we can really tap into that, then it actually becomes very powerful, because we can start to really offer them what it is that they need, using language, using validation in ways that they really accept and receive validation, or perhaps making sure that they're given a variety of choices, because naturally they wouldn't move that way, or else the opposite, making sure they have a limited amount of choices, because otherwise they feel overwhelmed.
Totally, totally. I think that is, it's a trend, like being so aware of our children. I feel like our generation, like our parents were just like, this is how it is and you're going to deal with it. They almost, like my dad says this, he's like, I'm one of four. So he's like, I've always treated you for as if you're one person, but you're also individual. And I'm like, yeah, we've been trying to tell you this.
Yes, yes. And I mean, before the Enneagram, before receiving this awareness of and knowledge of the Enneagram, I can see even with my relationships with my own parents, we see the world in very different ways.
Yeah. I was
And
going to
for,
ask,
Mhm.
having your parents with such a strong background in meditation, how were they as parents? Like, was your experience that they were very, they just like honor your own natural gifts, or was it, I know culture and all different things bring into that, but what was your experience like?
In terms of being encouraged to do anything, there was never any pressure.
Hmm.
And for that, I am just so grateful to them,
Yeah.
because sometimes there is this stereotype, sadly, that, Asian parents, they force, or they have these really high expectations. They
Hmm.
really wanted me to find what it was that I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so they really gave that space
That's
to
awesome.
explore and to be open. But that said, without knowledge, it's very difficult to really know how to treat one another and to understand one
Right.
another.
Especially because sometimes we're not even self aware. So if you're not even self aware, how are you aware of the people around you? And how
Absolutely.
can you, honor them and their own individuality if you can't even honor your own?
Totally. Totally.
So
So
interesting.
true.
So let's break it down. I know we talked, you and I spoke a bit, and I know there are 9 different types, basic types.
Yes.
We're not talking, all the other spin-offs. So let's go over the 9 types. And then could you give us a little brief, explanation, maybe?
Sure. So the 9 types, or the 9 ego lenses or energies, are speaking to the way in which we really see the world. And each of the types have a specific fear, need, desire that kind of goes along with it. And so the thing is that we all carry these 9 fears, desires, needs.
Mhm.
But there's one that really, really drives us more than the others. And to be able to really hone into that takes some deep questioning. And so sometimes people say, well, can I go check out an online test? And you can, but often I find that the reliability of those tests can be a little bit dicey, just because there's always this type of desirability bias that comes into play whenever we answer questions. Sometimes we answer questions based on how we aspire to be, or how we would like to see ourselves. Or sometimes we truly feel like I would do both when we're given a situation where use this or this. Like, well, I've
Both.
done both. How can I choose, right?
That's so
And so
funny because I had my consultation with you earlier this week, and it was the line of questioning was just it seemed random, but it also, like, I could tell there was a purpose, and there were a lot of those questions where it's like there's such a similarity or like such a big difference. So that's really interesting.
yeah, and to be able to really kind of help to discern, this is something that even as a coach, I find that my purpose and also receiving coaching, and what I benefit so much from it is to have a mirror, to have
Mhm.
somebody to actually show us what's going on within us. Because it's hard to see when you're experiencing something yourself. It's
Yeah.
hard to ask yourself questions when you sometimes feel you already know the answer. And
Right.
so and sometimes it just means that a person is tweaking a question. They're asking you the same question 3 different ways, and yet we don't register it as that. We register it as, wow, this is a completely different question,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so it takes this digging, really, to be able to really see what are the fears that are really driving me? What are the needs? And to me, needs and fears are really that combination, that bucket is really what we speak to as motivation,
Right. Yeah,
right?
that's so interesting.
And so each of these 9 types, as we say, or these 9 energies, have these very unique fears and desires associated with them. And so to kind of discern that is really the exciting phase, I would say,
Yeah.
of an Enneagram consultation or figuring out my type. Afterwards, I would say, is really where, the work begins.
Right.
And
Because I would imagine there's like a high expression of each number, but also a low expression.
absolutely, absolutely. And so this is, and that's perfect. Thank you for bringing that up. To the way that I learned the Enneagram, my own teachers learned from John Riso and Russ Hudson, who are kind of the preeminent Enneagram teachers within North America. I would even say the world now. And they always speak to the levels of consciousness or the levels of awareness.
Mhm.
And this is really what I would say is the most important piece to the Enneagram and to just life in general, to understand where is our baseline operations sitting at in terms of our levels of consciousness. And if you don't mind, I'll give this beautiful example that John Russo and Russ Hudson actually give. And so they say that if you take like a nail or a peg and you place it on the wall, and then you stretch a rubber band around it, the rubber band's going to go up a certain degree and down before it just completely snaps and breaks, right? Now, many of us sometimes think that in terms of awareness, oh, how far can I stretch up? We think of trying to grow our consciousness in that way.
Yep.
But it's kind of counterintuitive. It's actually, where is the nail?
Yeah.
Because based on where the nail is, if it's higher, then when we are in stressful times, when we dip down, we don't dip so low,
Right.
right? And when we're really accessing those moments of perspective and growth, then we're really being able to tap into these incredible healthy and like creative levels of consciousness.
Of course.
But it really depends on where that nail is. And so part of, to me, understanding the Enneagram, understanding your type, is also a deep dive into where is my average level of consciousness? Where is that nail?
Right.
And then how can I move it up?
So my question is, do the types have their own level of consciousness associated? Like, it's 1 through 9. So does that decipher where your consciousness is, or is it within each type you're going to see different levels? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So so I would almost say it's kind of both. So on one hand, all the levels of all of the types themselves, you will see a variety of levels of consciousness within them, and you can see even particular behaviors that kind of help to discern where you are at in terms of the levels of consciousness. So that is there. And so sometimes that behavior will look very different amongst the different types. And sometimes it could even look the same, but the motivation will be very, very different.
Ooh, it's kind of juicy. I like this.
Yeah. So for example, the type 1 you were speaking to, what are some of these 9 types? So I'll give some examples. The type 1 is very commonly known as the moralist, right? And sometimes the type 1s, they can seem extremely stubborn.
Okay.
Right. And the reason for that, if you really dig deep, is because they want to live a life of ethical integrity.
Mm.
And so when they feel as though something is jeopardizing that desire to live a life of high morals, of purity, then they can become very stubborn. Or it may seem stubborn externally.
Right. It's very black and white. They don't
Exactly.
allow that gray area sometimes.
Exactly. But when you look deeper, it's actually a very beautiful reason why. Now, the experience of that stubbornness does not seem so beautiful.
when you're having to deal with a stubborn person, it's not that pretty.
Yeah, exactly. But this is where, if we can actually, when we ourselves at our are operating at a higher level of consciousness, it kind of gives us that bandwidth to really dig deeper, to ask more questions. Instead of reacting to the behavior that we're experiencing, we can actually dig deeper to truly understand what's going on. And
Right.
this, to me, is the beauty of the Enneagram, because when we can truly seek to understand, then everything just becomes, it eases up. It's almost like this tight knot. And then you just start to pull a little bit at a thread, at a thread, at a thread. And then it starts to just soften and
Yeah.
release.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what's your type? Like what number are you?
So I am uh, the achiever type, known as the type 3. And so for the achievers, the heart, the kind of deep down desire, the core desire is to feel valuable. Right. And so you can
Yeah.
see all of us have this desire,
Of
right?
course.
We
Of
all want to
course.
feel valuable, but the way in which it kind of preoccupies our consciousness can be very different. So for
Right.
the type 3s, it's almost like unconsciously every interaction, every moment is kind of being categorized into, did I have an experience of value? Was I valuable? Was this of value to me?
Right. Right.
Right? Constantly, constantly, constantly. And you can see when we are unconsciously driven by something like that, which is very much valued and applauded within society,
Right.
right? Which can cause its own issues, to be
Of
honest,
course.
right? Because then other types can sometimes feel like, well, I don't feel like I'm an equal contributor when they have beautiful gifts to offer,
Right.
right?
Right.
So with this, we can see that if somebody's unconsciously driven by this, it could lead to becoming a workaholic. It can
Mhm.
lead to really sometimes even cutting off all my emotions because they're getting in the way of me being as efficient as possible. It
Yeah.
could lead to competition because now I'm starting to feel like if I'm not at the top, then everybody else is 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 almost like, it can almost feel sometimes like it's my enemy, as opposed to, hey, this is another human being who's trying to live to their own potential and their own value.
Of course.
But when we understand that and we can actually start to do the work, we can see that actually my own existence makes me valuable. There's
Yeah.
actually nothing to prove. It was funny. I was having, my husband and I were having a conversation with our mentors, and one of our mentors said, "You have nothing to prove." And I started laughing, and I looked at my husband and I said, "I wish I could believe that." And I could feel like this is like my three-ishness, like this
It's
achiever
coming out. Yeah.
ego that's coming
Showing
out. It's like, I
itself.
wish I could believe that. But by the end of the conversation, it was funny. Like, I actually started to feel a lot more of, yeah, external accomplishments and all of this. Yes, it doesn't mean that we should just like get rid of those aspirations.
Right.
But truly to see that my own growth as an individual and just being a human being as opposed to a human doing
Yeah. Whoa.
can be very powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now I have a couple more questions
Sure.
that were sparked with you just like having that conversation. Would What type is your husband? Do you feel comfortable to share that? Like how do the types work together? Like now I'm like, whoa, we're looking big lens here.
So I hope you don't mind. Typically I don't even share my type, but because he does this work too, I'm going to refrain from sharing his type just
That's
because
totally fine.
he normally is like, you tell me.
Yeah, of
This
course.
is typically my response too. But um, but I can say this because I think the heart of your question is, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, compatibility even amongst types,
Yeah. Or just
right?
like honoring each other, like knowing where you're at and then saying, okay, well, this person I know is this type. So, like, how can that work together in a relationship?
Beautiful. Yes. So one of the beauty of one of the pieces that I find so beautiful about the Enneagram is that all types are compatible. All
Yeah.
types are compatible if, and there is a caveat, of course, we are at a high level of consciousness. If each
Right.
individual is at a high level of consciousness, right?
That's
Because
beautiful.
what
Yep.
that means is that I truly have the ability to honor who you are.
Right. Right.
And I can see your gifts. And at the same time, because it can be an intimate relationship, I can also see the shadows. And I can perhaps help you with that part because perhaps that's not what I struggle with.
Right. Right.
Right.
And
So
that's how you
perhaps I
guys
can
can
help
work
you
together to
and
kind
you can
of,
help me.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So interesting. I love that. I love that.
So it's
Um,
all about moving that nail up.
right. And so typically, do you find that when you find someone's type or even your own type, do you tend to stay that? Is that kind of like where you're at? Or
So,
do people change types?
yeah, the common question actually. So you stay your type because if you think about it, when you think of like just type, it seems kind of like, oh, but wouldn't I want to grow?
Limiting. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But if you look deeper, your motivation doesn't change.
Right. Right.
Right.
As I asked it, and we determined that I'm primarily a type 7. So I'm thinking like, yeah, I don't think those things would actually change.
Mm, yeah. So great realization. So the motivation doesn't change. So from that perspective, your type doesn't change. But what does change is that you grow healthier in your type. And when you
Okay.
grow healthier in your type, and this is where the Enneagram can become very nuanced, you start to look and move towards another type.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
So
So
how
you,
so? Explain that a little.
so for example, the three, right? In so it's incredible because it's both within growth and within stress. You can move to a different type.
Okay.
Your at least your behavior can start to look like a different type.
Got it.
It doesn't mean you've changed, right? So for the
Mm-hmm.
three, for example, the three moves to the six, which is the type known as the loyalist
Mm-hmm.
in growth. And what that means is that I also need to battle through the shadows that the six faces. That's
Right.
what growth looks like.
Right.
So to make this very, very tangible, threes very often can come across as
Mm-hmm.
extremely confident, very decisive. Of course, this isn't all threes, but the majority of the time, because, in order to be successful,
Gotta just make decisions and
you
move
got to
on.
make decisions, need to be confident, right? Now, as you move towards the six, um, one of the, I don't want to say challenges, but one of the things that the sixes face very often, which they tap into, and they really tap into this reality, is that how can I truly know? And this is a really, really good question for especially types like the threes to battle with,
Right.
right? How can I truly, truly know?
Right.
How can I? And so when the threes start to grow, what happens is that they start to face these doubts within themselves.
Yeah.
And this is really, really important because now the threes are starting to truly access their own hearts and to see that what is real.
Yeah.
Am I living for the dreams of other people?
Yeah.
Am I being able to tap into my own authenticity? How do I know that? It's only through questioning. And the sixes are experts at questioning. They question like everything, which again, to some people may feel like that's insane. Just make a decision, right?
Right.
But if you
Right.
look, so we look at the negative, look at the positive. It's
Of
like,
course.
hey, there's
Right.
something truly, truly of substance here that they're tapping into, and they really want to know. And so as the threes start to encounter the shadow and face it within their own hearts and lives, they also start to realize that, just being of service is enough. I don't always need to be the star. I can
Yeah.
be, and this beautiful example is given within my husband's workshops, where they speak to I can be a star in a constellation of stars.
Right. Right.
So I can be at the top with so many others
Yeah, of
without
course.
any envy, without any competition, and with a full heart to say, wow, you did a great job. I'm so happy for you,
That's
without
so
feeling
beautiful.
any
Yep.
tinge of, and next time it's going to be me.
Right, exactly. So what does like a session with you look like? Not so much the consultation, or even we can start at the consultation, but if somebody wanted to work with you as a coach, what would that person be looking for? Like what would the goal of the sessions be?
Hmm. So people come with so many different desires, I guess you can really say, right? Whether
Hmm.
it's to really almost find themselves, shift careers,
Hmm.
really try to obtain more clarity, more purpose in their life, whatever it is. And what I find that it almost always boils down to that kind of like external, I would like to achieve this is very helpful.
Yeah.
But what tends to happen is it almost always goes 100 times deeper.
Right.
And
You don't say.
and it's funny because I'm currently reading this book, which I think is quite hot right now, and a lot of people are talking about it. It's called Atomic Habits,
Oh, I've
right?
heard of that. Yep.
And I believe the author's name is James Clear, if I'm not mistaken. And he speaks about how any change in habit or in behavior really needs to start with a shift in identity,
Interesting.
right? And
Yep.
so with any coaching session, even with the Enneagram consultation, typically we almost do like an inbuilt consultation if anybody wants to do more ongoing coaching. We start off there. We really start to look at what are the stories, what are the narratives that the person is already speaking to themselves about.
Interesting. Yeah. Because that's so true. And that's kind of the basis for how you're going to move forward, I would imagine.
Exactly. Exactly. And so
Awesome.
it may sound a little counterintuitive sometimes for people, and especially for threes, let me say that. It's kind of like, hey, like give me the like give me the to-do list, like let's
Yeah.
get started. And not to say only threes, there like many of us are really kind of are influenced by this type of energy of like,
Hmm.
I want this yesterday.
Right.
Like I want to achieve this yesterday. Like how fast can we move this? But one of the things, at least, that feels very authentic for me, and it's the only place I can work from and offer to other people is this is, I don't want to say slow growth, but this is deep growth.
Yeah. Which offers real opportunity for actual change. Like if
Yes.
you're actually serious about wanting to change whatever it is, you have to do that deep growth. You have to work with that shadow. At least, that's what I believe.
Yeah, and it's something I believe as well. And
Yeah.
so I know that there are incredible coaches out there who can offer results very quickly. I've seen that. But just seeing for myself the potential that the Enneagram has to offer, I feel like it would actually be a disservice for me to offer anything less.
I could imagine. I feel like I would be the same way. Like you're in 100 or zero.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. This is kind of like, hey, you're signing up for, again, going back to that analogy of increasing your level of consciousness, increasing
Right.
your awareness,
Right.
because that ultimately it will take care of everything else.
Absolutely.
It will.
And it's like that's, if we're getting deep here, like our soul, that's what we're here to do.
Yeah,
We're here to grow. We're here to accomplish that task.
yeah. And so typically, and it's incredible. Like no matter what the kind of goal somebody comes into, a coaching environment with, I find that it always goes to relationships. Always, it's amazing, and I find that just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But I also see why. Right. So whether
Right.
it's in the professional area, whether it's in the personal area, it
Of
doesn't matter
course.
because that's where egos rubbing up against each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even just if you take a step back and look at your life, like how many different relationships you have. You have your relationships, like you said, professionally. You have your relationship with your partner. You have a relationship with children. You have a relationship with parents. Like it goes so much beyond like, how do I find the person I love? Like they're every day, in
Every day.
almost every interaction, you're working in some kind of partnership.
Yeah.
There's
What to speak of a relationship with ourselves,
There we go. There
right?
we go. How do you feel that your relationship with yourself has changed since you were introduced to the Enneagram?
Mm, I feel like there's so much that I haven't been able to see. That's really
Prior,
it. I'm sorry.
prior to knowing?
No, no, now knowing about the
Oh,
Enneagram, really seeing
ooh,
like, wow, there's so much I don't see.
right.
And that is confronting,
Hmm.
very confronting.
Yeah.
And at certain moments, if I'm truly honest, at certain moments exciting, but most of the time confronting.
How so? Let's
It's
dive into that a little.
Yeah, sure. Confronting because I feel like many of us, actually, I won't even say that. I'm going to just speak about myself. I can say that for most of my life, if you had asked me, are you a self-aware person? I would say without batting an eye, yes, I
Right.
am self-aware. I love to write. I love to introspect. Conversations to me need to be deep, otherwise I feel like they're quite meaningless,
Yeah.
right? So, just given even those three things, I would say that of course I'm a self-aware person.
Right.
And then the Enneagram came along. And then I was also like my environment and my sangha, which is a word used in Sanskrit to say your association or the circle of influence of people you surround yourself with,
Yeah.
also shifted to those who are extremely self-aware. And boy, is it confronting, because at
Yeah.
that point I realized I'm actually not very self-aware, and it is still a very humbling experience.
Of course. Of
It's
course.
very humbling. And I feel like the people who are the most self-aware, and that this is definitely not me, but one of the things I recognize is that the more self-aware you are, it's something similar to the quality of humility. My husband said this once, and this really stuck with me very deeply, and that is qualities like that, like humility, are self-protecting properties or self-protecting qualities, meaning that the person who is actually humble doesn't even recognize they're humble.
Right. Right.
So, similarly, I feel like people who are self aware are almost unaware that they're self aware, right? Because they see how much work because they'll be the first ones to say, that's crazy. You cannot call me self aware. Look at this like pile,
That I
within
still
my
have to
heart
go through.
that
Right.
I still need to go through, right?
Right.
Whereas very often, and of course, I can't speak for everybody, and I would never want to, but sometimes the tendency I've seen, because I was one of those people, this is why I
Yeah.
can say it. When I do think I'm self-aware, I'm just like I'm like at the surface, or maybe like a couple of levels below. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I'm not like I haven't done like going to like the root of
Well,
this.
it's hard, scary work. Like
Yeah.
let's and we can only do so much like at a time because it is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's so funny you say that because I was just having this conversation with my sister. I'm like, you go through a little point in time where you're like, I'm good. I got this. Like I
Yes.
I don't need any other work. I got my shit together. And then it's like, bam, you're triggered with something, right? You're like,
Totally.
oh wait. Just
Totally. Absolutely. And to me, like those are the times where the ego has like is rearing its head, It's like, you
right.
got this, like, good
Right.
job. You just went through like this
Yep.
this whole period where you were so reflective, and you did all of these things, and the reason for that is because the ego is it it protects itself.
Of
It
course.
doesn't want change.
Of course. It's
You know,
happy. It's cozy. It's comfy.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
totally cozy. And so it's like feeding you all of these lines of like, you're good, you're totally self-aware. Oh my God, just see how so much more self-aware you are than that
Right.
person.
Of
And
course.
and that comparison trap is terrible, terrible, because when we do fall into it, we forget that it has nothing to do with anybody else. It has to do with just me and where I used to be and where I want to move towards.
That's it. That's it. It's amazing. So I know when you and I spoke earlier this week, you mentioned something about the types in body language. And that just like kind of stuck in my head. I was like, that is so interesting to me. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the ways in which to kind of help someone figure out their type. And again, this is helpful if there's, that mirror on the other side, because we don't know how we
Right.
come across, right? And even when we do like a video recording and we see ourselves afterwards, like it's very hard to not cringe and kind of ignore, right? So very difficult. So, but body language is actually something very, very helpful in figuring out your Enneagram type. And so you'll see that certain types are very, very kind of almost tense. And the way they naturally carry themselves is that they're kind of almost like squeezed a little bit.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But this is subtle, right? So within a crowd,
You
unless
have to know to look for it.
exactly,
Okay.
because this isn't something like so obvious. At least most of the times, it's not so obvious. So for some types, they might have that kind of like squeezed approach. For some types, you can just see there's just always like this natural smile on their face. It almost like takes over their face.
Right. Right.
Right.
It's like weird if they're not smiling.
Yeah, it's weird if
Like,
they're
what's
not
wrong?
smiling. It's amazing. Like there's even like a softness in features.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you can kind of tell like, ooh, they might kind of be this type. And then there are others, just by the way they walk into a room, even if they're not the boss, they're the boss.
Yeah.
Right. And we've all experienced that.
Of
Right.
course. Where you're
And
just like,
so,
oh, I got to talk to them.
right. Or like, so that's one way. Or the other way is they like walk in and like they just take over and they almost, they almost want you to be scared of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that
Right.
part like ego, like this is how I can protect myself kind of thing?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Interesting. Interesting.
So these are all kind of ways to kind of see. Also, you can see it in someone's eyes, right? For some types, like really, really hard for them to make constant eye contact.
Right.
Very difficult.
That's so interesting. Okay. So now I have a question about myself because you're
Sure.
talking about this. So knowing that I'm a type 7, what are some of the body languages that maybe go along with that?
Right.
There were a couple things you said that I was like, oh, I think that could be me. I think that could be me. I think that could be me.
Mm.
I'm like, well,
So,
not all those things. So, yeah.
so, and again, this isn't to stereotype in any way. This is, and this is the other thing that I realized. It's one piece of the puzzle.
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
It's one piece of the puzzle. So very often I've noticed amongst sevens constantly moving. Very difficult to kind of stay still.
Yeah.
Like there's this kind of like, there's almost so much energy. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. That's so true.
For example, I have another friend who's a 7, just constantly playing with her hair.
Oh my God. I always play with my hair.
Constantly playing with her hair, needs to have something in her hand to just kind of like doodle or to like constantly write something, tapping their feet all the time. There's just like this. I have so much energy.
That is so funny.
Right.
That is so funny.
I just need to constantly keep moving and be doing something.
Yeah.
So
That's so fun. Do you find that you try and guess people's type like strangers?
Well, so one of my favorite things to do, even prior to knowing about the Enneagram, was people watch. And so now it's almost like you develop a hypersensitivity to certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And it can, and it's also because it's my line of work, it can almost be unconscious.
Yeah.
Right. And so you just start to notice certain things. You'll notice how somebody walks into a room. You'll notice how they speak. You'll notice the words that they use. Word
Interesting.
choice can also
Yeah.
really give away a lot,
Yeah.
a
I could
lot.
imagine so.
But one of the things that I've also, I very strongly believe is that, and I think I mentioned this to you, that I'm always gathering evidence. It's never to say 100% this is your type.
Right. Well, we also mentioned that people are multiple types. Like it's not you, like I know I was primarily the 7, but I also had a strong 6. And
That's
I'm
right.
sure like, it goes along. There's so many different types that it's like, I know you had mentioned when we spoke earlier that there's like up to 1 billion different combinations.
Right. And so we have our type and then we have our wing.
Okay.
Right. And so, for example, you can be a primary 7 with a wing of a 6,
Right.
right? Typically, you have your primary type and you have your secondary type. And then after that, there are almost another layer you can add of instincts.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
And so the instincts also have a huge role to play. So sometimes you can look at one person who is identifies as a type 7 and another one, and you'll be like, how in the world are they both 7s? And that's because the core motivation is the same, but the way they show up, and again, if you were only to look at behavior, you would never be able to really get to the truth.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the instincts have a role to play because the instincts, there are 3 of them. They add another layer of energy, you could say, of how someone shows up. So there is the social instinct, which means that my wiring is very much always constantly attuned to other people,
Hmm.
right? So that's the social. There's the sexual instinct, which really gears towards experience, intensity. It's not sexual as in like, oh, I'm a sexual person. Rather, it's like
Yeah.
there's an intensity, there's like a drive. You can see it in somebody's eyes. It's like,
Right.
wow, okay, this is more of an intense person. And then finally, there's the self preservation instinct, which is exactly how it sounds. I am constantly aware of my environment. Comfort can be very important to me. There's a way in which I'm very aware of, for example, eating, of
Right.
making sure that I have enough water, that things may be cozy,
Yeah.
so these add another dimension. So
Right.
now you have that. And then on top of that, add in the levels of consciousness. And then you have like billions and billions of types.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, on the surface, it looks one way. And that kind of brings back to how we kind of touch upon astrology in the little bit in the beginning. And I find that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm a Taurus, but I don't really associate with being a Taurus. And it's like, well, that's only like your sun sign is like such a teeny tiny part of what your actual birth chart looks like. And that when you're talking about the Enneagram, that is kind of the connection that I made in my brain of like, okay, so on the surface we're this, but then you got to dive in because there's so many layers because we're humans and we're
Yeah.
that's just what it is.
Yeah. And we're humans that are constantly evolving, that are
Yeah.
constantly experiencing times of stress, times of
Yep.
growth, times of just kind of,
Hanging out.
status quo.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so interesting. This has been such a fun conversation. I feel like there's just so much to know about ourselves, and this is such a great tool to really dive in.
It is a great tool. I would say what it really offers is, and I think I might have mentioned this before, a language,
Hmm.
right? And so I can speak to what I'm experiencing in a way that I was never able to really speak to before. So, for example, if I am experiencing shame. I think now, probably in the last few years, this word is a lot more prominent. But if you look back, people like really avoided talking about that, right?
Yeah.
But the Enneagram speaks to that. It speaks to, certain emotions that may really predominantly drive us. So for some of us, it may be shame. For some of us, it may be fear. For some of us, it may be anger, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to really speak to those things and say, I'm experiencing this right now. I'm experiencing it in this moment. How I don't know what to do, right? And
Right.
so what the Enneagram can offer is that it's giving this wider perspective in terms of what you can do,
Right.
right? And it also almost like, in some sense, I can say gives you permission to just be who you are,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Because now I just realize, wow, I am wired differently than this person. Okay, like I can embrace that. And then that person can embrace how they're
Who they
wired.
are. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm for anything that gives you permission to just like lean into who you are and it makes it okay.
yeah. And this does that. And it also really can spark the fuel to grow,
Yeah.
to not just say like, okay, this is who I am. That's
Period.
it. Take it or leave it, right? Because that could mean like I get like the shadow side of you, or else I get like the amazing side of you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But rather to self incentivize really, and to say, actually, I can see what growth really looks like even within this kind of framework or this blueprint I come with,
Yeah, that's awesome. And I
right?
think it's important. I think it's important to acknowledge that everyone has shadow, that everybody deals with something that isn't sparkly, right? And
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this is something that I think we as a society tend to do. And that is, we spend a lot of time focusing on the gifts,
Yep.
right? And this is one thing that, at least for me, and just wired the way I am, it's probably the reason why I appreciate it. It's like, I like that the Enneagram goes deep into the shadow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that, because how can you deal with it if there isn't something to help you like go deeper into it,
Of course. Of course.
right?
And like, how do you even know? I mean, there's so many things that just spin off of that. It's like, we're not this idea of people being like perfect or like, oh, I really wish I was like that or I wish I was like this. It's like, no, you have really special gifts. You are really special.
Yes,
And there are also hard things you've done and overcome and things like that. Or just like you said, shame, fear, these things that maybe were triggered when we were young that we were not even conscious of show up in different ways as adults,
definitely.
you know?
Definitely. And to be able to really give space and give permission to say, I carry this. This is one thing that I very much appreciate, that I believe, again, it was Don Riso and Russ Hudson. They say this, that one of the things that very often can help a person to identify their type is when they hear about also the shadow and they go like, oh my God, this is
Yeah.
my type. This is the worst type.
Right.
As opposed to the best type, because
Right.
that's where normally we're like, oh yeah, this is amazing. I'm so glad I have all of this stuff. But to actually say like, God, I see that in myself. Like, this is the worst type. And that's not in a way to minimize the individual, but I think more it becomes a revelation for somebody that I spend a lot of time, or else I try to minimize the amount of time that I have to deal with the shadow. But
Right.
then when it really like comes to the fore, and it's presented to you in a very compassionate way, and to say, this is here. It's okay. You can work through this.
Right.
It
Right.
really gives permission to just actually also embrace the shadow, because when we don't embrace the shadow, we'll only avoid the shadow.
That's that was probably my biggest pattern when I was younger. It was like oh, that makes me uncomfortable. I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist.
Right.
It was hard work to get in there and to learn, like you're going to work through your shadow and you're going to live. It's going to be okay. Because
Yeah.
you're like that ego feels like if I face this, I'm not going to make it.
Yes. And the ego needs the heat, actually. It can take it.
Of course.
The only way for the ego to transform is to actually be able to take the heat.
Yeah, for sure.
And what it does is it has all of these mechanisms that it actually uses to protect itself. And we never actually what I notice at least is whenever we experience the heat, we like throw it out into the world.
Right.
And unfortunately, very often it lands upon someone and someone we really love, as opposed to actually being able to say, let it burn a little. Because when it burns, it's not that it's going to kill it. It's going to transform it into something much more beautiful.
Right. Right. I think, did you watch Game of Thrones?
I haven't actually.
All right, then never mind. I always have to ask because either you're like diehard or you're like, not my thing.
Well, I just felt like this could become an addiction. So
it totally can.
Yeah.
If you don't have time, don't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so fun. Well, I just have loved this conversation. I feel like you're so well spoken and you're just so you make it so understandable. So I thank you for that. And I would love for you to share, like, where can people find you? And is there any, special offerings or anything that you have going on right now that people can dive into?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Fiona. I know that even the way we connected was just so, I felt like providential, it was just very organic. And then also getting a chance to spend some time with you even before this podcast means a lot to me because I really value people's time. And, I think we spoke for 2 hours prior to this, and two separate occasions. So I think it also goes to show how much you are invested in making sure that this podcast really offers people who are listening to it something of substance and something that you deeply believe in. And I really, really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
So honored to be a part of this. And so in terms of people being able to find me, if you are a social media person, I can only do it in limited quantities. So I'm only pretty much on Instagram.
Smart. You're smart, Vrin.
No. I mean, like I'm on Facebook, but I can't.
I can't with Facebook.
I can't. So
too much.
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram. You can find me at illuminate.nyc, ILLUMINATE.NYC. And then if anybody is curious to get an Enneagram consultation, you can please feel free to reach out to me. So you can do so. You can find me on my website, which is illuminate.nyc, or else you can also email me. It's pretty simple. It's Vrin, VRIN @illuminate.nyc. And and if people are coming from your podcast, I would be so delighted to really spend some time with them. And kind of like what you mentioned, an Enneagram consultation will be an hour really dedicated to deep diving into who and what you are made up of. And then after that, we can also really look and see how we can really align your life based on, your internal wiring or any specific questions people have. And then with respect to coaching as well, it'll be really based off of that kind of foundation.
Yeah. And then I also saw on your website, you offer like partnership coaching and like group coaching. So that could be so helpful, even if it's not a romantic relationship, a business relationship, any of that. Like this is just great foundation for some really good work.
Yeah. Just really praying to be of service.
Yeah, of course. Well, this is awesome. I will put all that information in the show notes for people to be able to just like click it and bring you right to finding Vrin.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. It was so great to talk to you. And I'm sure we'll stay connected and we will definitely talk soon.
Wonderful. I can't wait. Thank you so much, Fiona.
My pleasure. Okay, there's our interview with Vrin from Illuminate NYC. Vrin, it was so great having you on the show. I enjoyed our conversation so much, and I hope you all enjoyed listening. Make sure to check out the show notes for all the information on how you can connect with Vrin. I appreciate you all listening so much, and please, if you enjoyed this episode, I would love it for you to subscribe and to share it with a friend. By you spreading the word, it really allows for the podcast to grow and for me to bring you new content and new guests every week. I also want to give a little shout out to all the patrons who are supporting the show each and every month with their contributions. Thank you all for your continued support. You guys can follow along with me at Clarity Through Chaos Podcast on Instagram and Patreon, and my website, claritythroughchaospodcast.com. All right, that's all I got for you guys this time. Catch you next week.